Feeling empty all the time is one of the hardest emotions to explain because it doesn't scream, it doesn't burn, and it doesn't always hurt sharply. It just sits there, quiet, heavy, a sense that something is missing even when life looks normal from the outside. You might be functioning, talking, working, smiling, yet inside there is a hollow space where emotion should be. This emptiness is confusing because there's no obvious reason for it. Nothing terrible is happening, yet nothing feels real either. This feeling often begins slowly. It doesn't arrive as emptiness at first. It starts as numbness, a reduced response to things that once mattered. Moments that should feel exciting feel flat. Sad moments don't fully land either. Over time, emotional flatness turns into disconnection, and disconnection turns into emptiness. You don't feel deeply sad, but you don't feel alive either. You exist somewhere in between. Psychologically, emptiness is not the absence of emotion. It's the result of emotions being pushed down for too long. When feelings aren't allowed space to move, the mind learns to mute them. This muting becomes a survival strategy. At some point in life, feeling deeply may have felt unsafe, overwhelming, or pointless. So the system adapted by lowering emotional volume. What begins as protection eventually becomes emptiness. Many people who feel empty learned early on that their emotions were inconvenient. Maybe they were ignored. Maybe they were told to be strong. Maybe there was no space for their inner world. Over time, they learned to stop expecting emotional connection. They learned to rely on themselves, to stay quiet inside, to not need too much. The cost of this self-control is emotional depth. Emptiness is often the aftermath of long-term self-suppression. When you consistently override what you feel, your mind stops sending strong emotional signals, not because there's nothing to feel, but because it learned that feeling doesn't lead anywhere. The system conserves energy by shutting down emotional expression. This shutdown feels like emptiness. Another layer of emptiness comes from disconnection with meaning. When life becomes repetitive, mechanical, or driven purely by obligation, the inner world begins to fade. You do what you're supposed to do, not what resonates. Over time, the gap between who you are and how you live widens. That gap feels empty. You may notice that emptiness becomes more noticeable in quiet moments, when distractions fade, when the noise stops. That's because distraction fills space. It keeps you from noticing what isn't there. Silence removes the cover, and what you feel then is not boredom, it's the absence of emotional engagement. Many people try to fix emptiness by adding more stimulation, more scrolling, more work, more entertainment, more people. But emptiness isn't cured by addition. It's created by disconnection. You can fill your time and still feel hollow because the issue isn't lack of activity, it's lack of emotional presence. There is also a strong connection between emptiness and identity. When you live for long periods disconnected from your authentic self, the sense of me weakens. You do things, but you don't feel like the one doing them. Life feels like it's happening around you rather than through you. This detachment creates a sense of internal absence. Psychologically, emptiness can be the mind's way of avoiding pain. If feeling deeply once led to hurt, disappointment, or rejection, the system learns to shut feelings down entirely. This avoids pain, but it also avoids joy, connection, and meaning. Emptiness is not neutrality. It's the cost of emotional safety at the expense of emotional richness. Another hidden cause of emptiness is unresolved grief. Not just grief for people, but grief for unmet needs, lost versions of yourself, and lives you never got to live. When grief isn't processed, it doesn't disappear. It settles quietly beneath awareness, numbing everything above it. You don't feel sad, you feel empty. Emptiness also grows when you don't feel seen. Even if people are around you, if no one truly understands you, the inner world starts to retreat. Emotional isolation doesn't always look like loneliness. Sometimes it looks like being surrounded but untouched. Over time, the mind stops reaching outward, and the inside begins to feel vacant. Many people mistake emptiness for depression, and while they can overlap, emptiness has its own psychological signature. Depression often hurts. Emptiness feels blank. It's not crying, it's the inability to cry. It's not despair, it's the absence of desire. This distinction matters because emptiness requires reconnection, not just relief. One of the most painful aspects of emptiness is the guilt around it. You may think you shouldn't feel this way, that you have no reason, that something must be wrong with you. This self-judgment deepens the disconnect. The more you criticize your emptiness, the further you move away from understanding it. Emptiness is not a personal failure. It's a psychological signal, a sign that something inside you has gone unheard for too long, that parts of you have been waiting quietly without response. The emptiness isn't asking to be filled, it's asking to be felt. The moment you stop trying to escape emptiness and start observing it, something shifts. You begin to notice its texture, its weight, its patterns, and slowly you realize that emptiness isn't nothing, it's space. Space created by years of emotional silence. This space can feel frightening because it confronts you with what hasn't been lived, expressed, or acknowledged. But it's also where reconnection begins. Because what feels empty is often full of unexpressed truth. Emptiness often has roots that go far back, usually to times when your emotional needs were not met in ways you could understand or articulate. Childhood does not have to be visibly traumatic to leave this mark. Sometimes it is the quiet absence of emotional safety that shapes the inner world most deeply. When feelings were ignored, minimized, or misunderstood, the mind learned early that emotional expression was unnecessary or unsafe. Over time, this lesson becomes internalized, and adulthood carries the echo of that silence. A child who learns to stay quiet emotionally often becomes an adult who feels empty, not because there is nothing inside, but because everything learned to hide. When emotions had no witness, they stopped asking to be seen. The nervous system adapted by lowering emotional awareness, creating distance between feeling and consciousness. This distance feels like emptiness later in life. Many people who feel empty describe a sense of watching life rather than living it. This psychological detachment is a protective response. When emotional closeness once felt unpredictable or painful, distance became safety. But safety built on disconnection eventually feels hollow. The mind protects you from pain, but it also blocks intimacy, passion, and meaning. Another important layer is the role of self-abandonment. Over years of prioritizing survival, approval, or stability, you may have ignored your own emotional signals. Needs were postponed. Desires were silenced. Boundaries were softened. Each small act of self-abandonment may not feel significant in the moment, but together they create a deep sense of inner absence. Emptiness is often the feeling of having left yourself behind. This is why achievements don't cure emptiness. You can reach goals, build a life, and still feel hollow if those achievements were disconnected from your inner truth. Success without self-connection feels empty because it doesn't nourish the parts of you that were ignored. The mind recognizes progress, but the heart remains untouched. Emptiness can also intensify during periods of transition. When old identities no longer fit but new ones haven't formed yet, the space in between can feel like nothingness. This isn't a sign of failure. It's a psychological threshold. The discomfort comes from the loss of familiar structures before new meaning has settled. The mind interprets this uncertainty as emptiness. One of the most misunderstood aspects of emptiness is that it often hides emotion rather than lacking it. Beneath emptiness, there is usually grief, anger, longing, or fear that hasn't been allowed expression. The emotional system shuts down not because feelings are gone, but because they feel too much to hold alone. Emptiness is the lid placed on an overflowing container. Reconnection does not begin by forcing yourself to feel better. It begins by allowing yourself to feel honestly. This means sitting with the emptiness without immediately trying to escape it, observing it without judgment, letting it exist without labeling it as wrong. When you stop fighting emptiness, it slowly starts to speak. As you stay present with it, you may notice subtle sensations, tightness, heaviness, restlessness. These are not emptiness, they are emotions waiting for permission. The body often holds what the mind avoids. Paying attention to physical sensations can gently reopen emotional awareness without overwhelming it. Another key step is rebuilding a relationship with your inner world. This means asking yourself simple, quiet questions and listening without expectation. What do I feel right now? What do I need? What am I avoiding? At first, the answers may be unclear. That's normal. Emotional connection returns gradually, not all at once. Connection with others also plays a role, but only when it is safe and authentic. Superficial interaction does not heal emptiness. Being seen without performing does. Even one relationship where you can exist without explanation can begin to soften the internal void. The nervous system relearns that connection is possible. Creative expression is another doorway out of emptiness, not for productivity or validation but for release. Writing without structure, drawing without purpose, speaking without filtering. Creativity bypasses logic and gives form to what has no words. It allows emotion to move again. It's important to understand that emptiness doesn't disappear suddenly. It transforms. As you reconnect with suppressed parts of yourself, emptiness may briefly turn into sadness, anger, or grief. This is not regression. It's progress. Feeling again means the emotional system is waking up. Healing emptiness is not about becoming constantly happy. It's about becoming present, being able to feel joy and pain without shutting down, being able to sit with yourself without distraction, being able to exist fully inside your own experience. Over time, the space that once felt empty begins to feel open instead. Open to curiosity, open to meaning, open to connection. What once felt like nothing becomes possibility. The emptiness was never a void, it was unused emotional space waiting for your return. You are not broken for feeling empty. You adapted, and now you are unlearning that adaptation. Slowly, gently, in your own time.